You can share your screen or chat.
All right. Shelley, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's really an honor to be here speaking with all of you. I am excited about the work that Shelley has told me about that your group is doing. Here we go. And so today I want to kind of give you and share with you some of the, let's see, actually I need to move this a little bit out of the way. There we go. Share with you what I've learned along my journey in this field. And granted, I'm a young professional in this field, and I've not been here as long as many of you may be. But there have been things that I've learned that I think are important to share, and I want to share those with you today. So as you can see in my title here, I want to kind of get at the substance, what I believe and what I've seen to be the substance of disrupting patterns of homogeneity when it comes to the demographics of who's experiencing wildlife, who's enjoying wildlife, who's watching, and who the workforce is behind maintaining these spaces and conservation programs, et cetera. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on windows, mirrors, and having and maintaining and acting on a long-term perspective, and I will be explaining what each of those things mean. So just to give you a little bit of backstory about me, so I had a very early interest in wildlife, and from just what I've seen, I think that when it comes to wildlife professionals, most can say that they've probably had an early interest in wildlife, but that interest that I had was paired with the fact that I had no exposure to wildlife viewing. I had no exposure to wildlife careers. And on top of that, I never saw any reflection of myself. So some of my heroes growing up were people like Steve Irwin and Bill Nye the Science Guy and the Kratt brothers, is that what their names are? Zumbumafu, you know. So a lot of the people that I saw, I loved them, right? Phenomenal science communicators, phenomenal explorers, and I ate it up, right? But that was actually reinforcing an idea that I was not meant to do that. While I loved watching them do it, it wasn't for me. But I really hit a stroke of luck when I was in high school, my senior year, and I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I grew up in Philadelphia. And at my church, there was a man who, you know, had heard that I was really into animals and liked animals, and so he goes, you know, hey, Corina, my sister is actually, she works at the zoo, so I'm going to connect you to so that she can, you know, help you out in your field. You know what my first thought was? My first thought when he told me that was, she works in concessions, so why would you bother connecting me? I want to work with animals, right? And the fact that that was my first thought is extremely telling for what homogeneity does to people who are not in that majority, to people who are not represented in these fields. And so it wasn't actually until recently that I really reflected on how much I was impacted by the lack of reflection that I had of myself. But I ended up connecting with her, and it turns out that she was actually the lead carnivore keeper at the Philadelphia Zoo. And the Philadelphia Zoo is a massive zoo, first zoo in the United States, so it has a long history, so very prestigious among zoos and aquariums and conservation organizations. And what she did for me was incredible. She set me up with an internship. I knew nothing about the zoo. I had never been to a zoo before, had a totally incorrect conception of what zoos were. She invited me to apply for a zoo internship, put a good word in for me, and then took me behind the scenes of where she worked and showed me what her in and out every single day looked like. So I saw her doing her job. And so my first ever internship in wildlife conservation, my first experience was in education. And so my work at the zoo was telling the guests that would come through everything that I was learning about the animals there, their conservation plights, their natural history, and just sharing my own passion and getting as many people infected with that same passion as I could. And the really powerful thing about that experience is that in the course of like a month, I was given a window and I was given a mirror. I don't remember who coined this phrase, but I remember seeing it online somewhere that kids, anyone, needs windows and mirrors in order to end up, you know, in a field, particularly talking about careers. And for me, Michelle, the Black female lead carnivore keeper was a window for me. So she was my exposure. She was the mechanism by which I was exposed to the options for me. For as someone who's interested in wildlife and wanted to see and work with wildlife, she showed me what that looked like and what was possible. And she was also a mirror. So she was a reflection of myself. She was a Black girl from the hood, from Philadelphia. And it wasn't until I actually saw her doing the zookeeper job that I was like, oh, wow, like that's something that I can do. And I had never once consciously thought to myself, hey, you know, I'm a Black woman and this is only for white men, so therefore I can't do it. That was never like a conscious thought, but my mind had been structured to think that way. On top of that, on top of being that window and being that mirror for me, she also maintained a relationship with me. So she didn't just do, you know, hit me up and say, hey, come see me behind the scenes, and then that was it. No, she repeatedly reached out to me afterwards. She continued to check in on me over the years, to offer advice, to offer mentorship. And that was extremely powerful for my staying in the field. So maintaining that relationship with me. So my response to that, my response to seeing just how powerful having a window, having a mirror was to my presence and my ability to even exist in this field, I decided that I wanted to recreate the opportunities that were given to me, because in my opinion, kind of the root issue is that the workforce, the people who are visible, the people who are designing the programs, the people who are doing the work, don't look like me. And so I wanted to do whatever I could to address that. And so I wanted to address the career pipeline when it comes to wildlife careers. And because my specialty after graduating college was in animal care, that was kind of where I put my focus. So I had the distinct honor of being able to start and direct two programs that I'm going to kind of describe to you so you can see what the intricacies of that kind of a program looked like. The first was Pathway to Animal Care Careers, which was at the Nashville Zoo, which is my former employer before I went to grad school, which I'm in now, and was employed by Georgia Audubon. And the second was called the Malone University Wildlife Careers Program, which was a program that I fashioned in conjunction with my alma mater, Malone University in Canton, Ohio. So just to break it down for you, so the Pathway to Animal Care Careers Program provided a couple of really important windows of learning. So first off, it provided hands-on experiential learning opportunities for Title I high school students in the Nashville area. And so one student would come and pair with me for a day, and they would get to do all the keeper activities. They would get to have behind the scenes tours and question and answer sessions with professionals throughout the zoo with different expertise. And it provided exposure to a kind of representation that most people, most of them have never seen before. And it looks like the formatting just got a little weird on the screen sharing situation. So I apologize about that. Hopefully the message still gets across. Alrighty. So as it concerns the Malone University Wildlife Careers Program, that program was one that really focused on kind of embedding the exposure and the reflection into the everyday lives of students. And so this program was in partnership with a local Title I high school in the city of Canton, Ohio. And it provided long-term experiential learning opportunities. So there were animals, for example, that were donated to the high school. There were animal professionals that paired with the students, taught them how to take care of different taxa of creatures, gave them responsibilities for their daily care. And this program also provided college preparation. So part of the ways that we were able to kind of embed the exposure and embed the experiential learning opportunities into the everyday lives of students was by forming a wildlife careers club on grounds at the school, which is the club that cared for the animals that I was just mentioning. They also had regular, I believe, monthly meetings with different career professionals. So sometimes we would have professionals come to the school, or they would be able to Skype in with professionals from around the country who had various careers in the realm of wildlife sciences, whether they were veterinarians or zookeepers or wildlife rangers, to kind of expose them to the range of ways in which they could participate and engage their passion for wildlife whether they just had an interest and wanted to be involved and wanted to learn more about exploration of the outdoors, or if they were thinking about being on path for a career in wildlife sciences. And one of the things that was really important is that a lot of these issues when it comes to, okay, what are the factors that filter certain demographics out? It's never one factor, right? So representation, lack of exposure, those, those are two factors that contribute to it, but there can be a myriad of them, and typically are, and they're usually intersectional. And for this particular city and this particular high school, one of the issues that they were facing was that college was not really part of the culture of many of the students' expectations for their future. So most of them, when I would go and speak with them and just learn about what their future, what they thought their future would look like, many of the students, they were like, well, when I graduate high school, I'm going to go work at, there's a couple local factories, and that was really the pipeline. And so in order to disrupt, the homogeneity in wildlife viewing, in wildlife professions, we had to not just address, the lack of access. We also had to address, the fact that students weren't exposed and did not conceptualize what it would look like for them to go to college. So we would, because we were paired with Malone University, they would have college visit days, so they would see the dorms, they would meet with the financial aid officer so they can kind of conceptualize what that process looks like. Because if you don't know, that can be very daunting. We even had class visits for different subjects that they were interested in. And it culminated in a wildlife career summer camp at the end of the summer. Now, I kind of want to talk about the mechanism, right, of disrupting homogeneity, particularly in the space of wildlife sciences, wildlife viewing, outdoor exploration, because I've seen many scenarios in which there will be a group of working people, a task force, or an organization that is extremely homogenous, usually all white, often older generation, but sometimes not. And they say they recognize that the lack of diversity is a problem, and they want to address that problem. However, they don't necessarily know how. And so what I typically have seen most commonly is, they say, they'll have events where they would like people who are not like them to show up to these events, people of different ethnic backgrounds, maybe LGBTQIA community, people of different abilities, and to draw them in, there's kind of this conception that, if we eliminate the barriers, they'll show up, right? So if the event does not have like a financial barrier, right? So if it's free, the people who maybe wouldn't be able to afford a cost will show up. Or if, addressing any number of other barriers, but even when they do that, they don't see any results, and they still are left with the same homogeneous group of people. And there's kind of a disappointment, and almost like falling into like a paralysis. What do I do? I invited them, I took the barrier away, and no one's here. What do I do? And what I've realized is that it takes having a long-term perspective on addressing homogeneity in these spaces, and one that is rooted in relationships. So a couple of, I'm going to kind of go through some steps that I have done personally and that I think are very important for people to consider when they're addressing this issue. And so the first step that I did, and that I think is very important, that I've seen other people do as well, is to do a community resource map. So assess what resources you as an individual or as a group or as an organization, what resources do you have access to? So for example, expertise, and I'm going to kind of share what my personal resources were in the process of making specifically these two programs. So what expertise do I have access to? I had access to zoo professionals because I was one. I had access to wildlife rehabilitators. I had access to environmental monitors, gardeners, outdoor explorers, park rangers. And so, okay, I knew I had this, pool of expertise that I could use. Then when I think about finances, what financial resources do you have access to? For the program that I started with my university, there was a grant that was that was up for grabs essentially by the city of Canton. It was a housing and urban development grant to address issues of access. And so I applied for that grant, ended up getting it, and that is what funded this program. And then relationships. What relationships? Because relationships are very important resources. What relationships do you have? What relationships do I have? What community members am I acquainted with, either as personally as an individual or as an organization. And then who do they know, right? Because different degrees of separation can still be valuable, because the network of your network can still contribute to whatever you are trying to do. And so for me, when I was at the zoo, for example, I knew, okay, I'm a zookeeper, so I work in animal care, but I am associated with individuals in the education department here. And those education departments are affiliated with the high schools in the area. And so I knew, okay, this education department is going to have the best contacts for who I should reach out to. Because if I just send a blind email to a principal at a random Title I high school, that's likely not going to be the best way, the best mechanism to gain contact. So I asked, though, I went to my network and I said, what is the best mechanism for accessing the demographic, accessing the schools that I want to? And I used those relationship resources that I had. So when it comes then to community engagement, and again, I apologize for this weird formatting that's happening here. When it comes to actually engaging the community, right? So you've kind of understood your asset map, you've kind of mapped out what you have access to as an individual or as an organization. You understand that access. The next step then is to craft a plan for making contact with the communities of interest that you have, and building a relationship with them. And so it's important that the perspectives of the community is what's driving every move that you make when it comes to wanting to include them and wanting them to be part of the work that you're doing. So the first question to ask yourself, of course, is who are the people in the community that I'm trying to reach? So for me, I knew, and being part of the community that I wanted to reach, I knew that I wanted to address and I wanted to reach the demographics that were particularly underrepresented in the zoo field. And so I knew that those were Black people, brown people, people of color, Indigenous people, people from low income backgrounds. Those were the communities that I wanted to make sure I was reaching. The second question and really important question that you then have to ask is, what do they care about? What are their concerns? Which is a really important question to ask, because if you are building a foundation based on what your concerns are, or what you assume the concerns of others are, it's very easy to miss the mark. So because I was from the community I was trying to reach, and again, to be clear, I cannot speak and will never speak on behalf of all Black people or all people of color, because not even all communities of Black people or Indigenous people or any ethnic group are the same or have the same concerns or issues or anything like that. So this is not to say that this is a blanket, when you know about one person, you know about them all, because that's not true. That's never true. But I was kind of working with a team of one, and I knew some of the perspectives from that community, from my own interactions with other people and from my own story. And so I knew that the zoo is expensive, right? That's a concern. I had me and my family and my friends all had horrible misconceptions about zoos and zoo careers. And I firmly believed that it wasn't for people like me, which is why, back to what I had said at the beginning, which is exactly why I thought Michelle was a concessions worker, which is nothing wrong with a concessions worker, of course, but that's, the fact that I thought that's what she was and assumed that's what she was, kind of gets at that lack of representation. And then thirdly, how can the resources that you have access to, after you've completed that resource map, address their concerns? And so I knew that with my resources, I had access to a wide range of animal care expertise, because I worked at a zoo with multiple departments. I had connections with multiple professionals. I also had access to opportunities for learning, right? So I had the ability and the capacity to bring mentees under me and to say, hey, come chop up this meat and feed it to a hawk with me. Come go on the path and educate the zoo guests about whatever animals with me. And I also had interdepartmental support and staff time available to me. And so I knew I had that at my disposal, and then diverse staff, which was me, right? So when it came to representation, I was all the zoo had as far as ethnic diversity is concerned, which is of course a problem that I was trying to address. So I wanted to provide an example of what I believe is a really good reflection of putting into practice good, long-term perspective when it comes to programming and kind of utilizing the tools and the tactics that I have kind of picked up on and accumulated over time, which I shared with you. And one of them is at Georgia Audubon, where I have been working for 3 weeks now. So I'm very new, but this program was the first one that caught my eye, and I was just so excited that it existed. And so I want to kind of share with you what that has looked like. So this program is called, oh, I'm so upset about this, this formatting, sorry about that. So this program is called Connecting Students with STEM Through Birds, CSSTB for short. And so this program exists to invest in long-term wildlife viewing access for elementary school kids right now in Atlanta, Georgia, with the perspective that these children are going to grow up to be any number of various professionals, but with the experiences that they're going to have now that they will have embedded into their learning every single day will help shape them into people who are either professionals in this field, in this wildlife viewing field, or in the wildlife sciences, or to be people who are professionals of various kinds, who are concerned about the environment, who are outdoor explorers, and can be future stewards of the environment. So this program is rooted in the fact that Georgia Audubon staff connects with Title I school teachers in Metro Atlanta and builds relationships with them. That is the very first step before anything else happens. Secondly, based on the relationship that is built with the teachers and understanding what their teaching goals are for their classrooms, because oftentimes in public schools, can be fairly rigid teaching metrics, and so they have to like meet certain criteria as far as what they're talking about, what subjects they're getting to in the classroom. And so hearing that and knowing what the teachers need, Georgia Audubon then crafted a curriculum about birds to incorporate into the science classes that meets the needs of the teachers so that they can supplement their learning, the learning of their students, while also meeting the needs they have as far as the benchmarks that they need to meet in the classroom. And then once they have that curriculum, Georgia Audubon, along with local landscapers and the classroom that is being sponsored by this program, gets a bird-friendly learning garden installed. And so Georgia Audubon and the landscapers in the class go out for one day and they install plants, excuse me, I'm not really a plant person, so I don't use great plant terminology. They plant native plants that attract various native wildlife, especially, you know, we're focusing on birds, but various pollinators and other native wildlife, so that right there in Metro Atlanta, in a city environment, the kids in this classroom have a place to view wildlife up close. Not only do they have a place to view wildlife, they are equipped with the curriculum and with the learning resources to know and to engage deeper about what they're looking at, and have it all facilitated by their teacher that, again, is in relationship with Georgia Audubon. And then on top of that, of course, they are then provided with the resources to view wildlife, right? So, you know, just walking around outside can give you a plethora of natural biodiversity to look at, but when you have things like binoculars and a field guide, that just makes your experience a lot more rich, and you can see a whole lot more. So the classrooms are also equipped with viewing materials and identification materials so that they can be engaged with that learning garden. And the nice thing is that because they're native plants, it's not a space that needs to be, you know, kept up and repeatedly taken care of. Like the world around it is caring for the garden. The students install it, they have a sense of ownership because they put those plants there, and then they can just use it to learn about the world around them. And of course, it doesn't stop there. The relationships that were built with the teachers don't just stop at, you know, we install the garden and then they never hear from us again. The education staff at Georgia Audubon follows up multiple times with the teachers from these classrooms to say, hey, you know, what has your experience been? And there's essentially a round table of all the teachers that have classrooms with this program, and they share their experiences, they share things that they've learned, new ideas about engaging their students in this learning activity. And the really awesome thing is that this learning garden, as I said earlier, is a form of wildlife viewing that is now embedded in their every single day life, you know. And so a lot of times, sometimes a perspective on diversifying a space or diversifying, you know, or kind of trying to prompt interest or light the fire of interest in especially young people is like, okay, let's take a group bird walking, you know, or bird watching, excuse me. You know, and, you know, we organize a bird walk and then that's kind of it, you know, and that has value. There is so much value, and even just one experience, one exposure to wildlife viewing or exposure to wildlife careers, like it is a window, right? And windows and mirrors are very important. But to embed that lifestyle and to embed that exploration and to embed that kind of learning into the everyday lives of especially kids, but any group that you are trying to reach, making that part of their everyday experience is really what's going to contribute to them being engaged in the future, right? So whether you're talking about young elementary school kids that will one day grow up to be professionals in any number of fields, or you're talking about college students that, maybe it's a local Audubon chapter and you're saying, we're all white and we're all over 65 and we really want to have a diverse audience or a diverse group here. When you build those relationships with people around you, yeah, if you say, hey, show up to our board meeting or show up to our Audubon meeting, you may not really get a huge response right away, but if you kind of build a relationship over time and kind of expose the people that you are interested in having as part of your community to what you do and build familiarity with each other over time, learn about them, that the likelihood that those teenagers, those college kids, whoever they are, would then in the future maybe join their local Audubon chapter, maybe start one, would greatly increase. And so the reason why this program I think is so wonderful is because it does embed, bird watching, wildlife watching, touching, engaging, learning about the natural world into the everyday life. It's not a one-off event. It is part of the learning experience of these children. So, now what, right? So people are at various stages, people are at various positions when it comes to what they can do to diversify their space. Sometimes it's a team of one, which was the case for me. Sometimes you have a whole organization backing you, which is a really awesome situation to be in. But just to recap and to kind of give some jumping off points and ending points here, you want to, again, explicitly identify the audience you are trying to reach. You need to map the resources that you have access to that can contribute to the work that you're doing. Build relationships with the individuals, with the people who are part of the communities that you want to engage in the work that you're doing. And then hold the work that you're doing accountable to those communities that you want to serve, because oftentimes we see organizations come up with these metrics, like we want this percentage of people of color on the workforce, we want this percentage of people of different genders on the workforce, but then they don't hold the work they're doing accountable to those groups. And so you really can't expect to have much success in that kind of a context. You need to make sure that whatever you're doing is done with your accountability facing the community that you want to serve, not the opposite. And of course, that is the foundation for building efforts that address the perpetuation of homogeneity with long-term success. So if you want those, if you want people to be engaged in the work that you're doing and to kind of disrupt that pattern, because homogeneity is self-perpetuating, right? When someone looks at a field or looks at an activity or looks at a space and says, that doesn't look like one I want to be a part of, for whatever reason, they're not going to show up. And then them not showing up means that they're not going to bring anyone else in. And then the next person who sees the space, doesn't see themselves, and it keeps going. But the people who see themselves are going to be more inclined to be part of that community, which is what we would expect to happen. But just to know that it is self-perpetuating. So you have to take a very kind of long game perspective to this kind of work. So with that, this is my contact information, my email address, if anyone is interested in reaching out. I'm again, very new to this job that I have with Georgia Audubon, and I'm always looking for people to learn from and collaborate with and put our heads together on ideas for programming. So certainly feel free to reach out. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. And I wanted to, with the remaining time, hear from, I know there's a lot of people in this chat. Thank you. I haven't been able to read the comments, but thank you so much. I did want to kind of hear from you all. So I think one of the most important resources that we have is each other, people doing this work. And so I first wanted to know if there are people here who have had success or failure in addressing the homogeneity in their space, if they've done so in your place of work or wherever you might be addressing it. What have those successes looked like? And if you've had failure, what have those failures looked like? And I think that's important to know and to communicate and for us to hear from each other, because we want to reinvent the wheel as few times as possible. And it's important, of course, to know that there is no one-size-fits-all answer for addressing lack of diversity in any space. The only thing that fits all is building relationships. But I would love to hear what the experience of any of the 76 people in this group have been. And so you can feel free to, what did we say? Like kind of, if you wanted to speak to avoid, I guess, maybe a bunch of people unmuting at the same time, if you wanted to kind of share anything, if you could put into the chat that you wanted to share, and I can just call your name, and that way we can maybe have a more streamlined process for sharing. But again, yeah, so if you have seen, whether you've done, experienced, or witnessed successes in addressing homogeneity, I would love if you could share that with me, with the group, so that we can have an idea of what that looked like. Or if you've had failure in that realm, if you'd be willing to share that as well, that would be, I think, very helpful. And certainly don't be shy.
Don't be shy. This is Shelley too. And we're looking at chat to make sure if someone brings something up, we do want to give y'all a place to chat. So wildlife and nature tourism programs, what are y'all doing, or what has been successful, or where have you lacked success so far? And I do want to say, people are reiterating in the chat, just thank you for laying out a process, really bringing it to life with your own experience, but not just this is an issue that we should be working on. We've heard that talk a lot, but having you talk through breaking it down on doing a resource assessment and thinking about what the audience is specifically that you want to reach, because there are a lot of different diverse audiences, and you can't just maybe be out for all of them. You need to be specific and have different tactics for each, and that has a lot to do with relevancy, roadmap, and tactics there. So this is great.
Exactly. And I think it's one thing that's really been great is that I think more recently we've just the dialogue about this has reinforced the fact that, you know, because a lot of times people were like lumped, you know, people of color, people who are not white are kind of lumped in people of color, and efforts addressing lack of diversity are kind of blanketed in this term people of color. But there are so many, even within a group, within people of color, you cannot take a blanket approach. So you can only imagine how lumping everyone who's not white together in kind of diversity efforts could lead to, you know, kind of stagnation. So I've been really encouraged by seeing people specifically call out, you know, what are the needs of any individual community locally and in general. So it looks like
we have a question from Scott, and then we have two success stories from Julie and a name that isn't a real name, so I don't know what they're saying. So Scott's question, do you want to address that first?
Sure, yeah. I don't see it right now.
Any suggestions for motivating those in authority to take or allow action towards courting diverse constituencies? That's a big question.
Yeah. So for me, one of my friends asked me a really profound question like 4 years ago. We were talking about science, just broadly, and she said, what does nature have to show us about the importance of diversity? And at first I was like, oh, let me think. And then it like hit me like a bag of hot bricks. And it was like, we like in the space of wildlife, whether you're like a scientist or you're, whatever capacity in which you exist in the space, or even just recreationally, you understand and so value diversity. Like we understand that diversity is like the bedrock of a successful ecosystem, of genetics, whatever it might be, like at any layer of the biological hierarchy, whether you're talking about at the molecular level, the population level, the ecosystem level, we understand that diversity is critical for survival and critical for resiliency. And I think that one of the most important and truest, I guess, arguments you could say, points for why diversity has to be intentionally sought out is that your progress is stagnated by a lack of diversity. When you have nothing but people from the same cultural background, so say you have all white people in your space, that is also likely going to produce a more homogeneous set of perspectives. And especially in the field of wildlife like conservation, when you're having to do problem solving for very intersectional issues, it's so important to have as many diverse perspectives as possible, because just like with genetics, if you have a population that has a lot of genetic diversity, it's going to be likely that when a stressor comes by, someone's genetic code is going to have the answer, right? And the same applies to a problem-solving group of people when you're presented with these challenges, which we are constantly presented with, right? Especially in the sciences, especially in wildlife sciences and conservation. We are constantly presented with problems, and we need to do everything we can to increase the likelihood that that answer will be in our midst. And the only way to do that is to have as diverse a working group as possible. And so that's always kind of the perspective that I've taken to the case for diversity. Because oftentimes, you know, diversity efforts are kind of framed as making up for the, what do you call it? Like the failures or you know, of minorities in the country. And someone, I can't remember who said it, but someone said it's not making up for the shortcomings of individuals or oppressed groups. It's making up for the shortcomings of the institutions that have created these homogeneous environments. So that's my response to that.
And that's great. And I've heard that too. It's just bringing it back to the science. If you want to make an argument to the higher ups, talk in their language, but then talk about it in scientific terms. And there's no one that can disagree with the fact that diversity is important for ecosystem health. So hopefully they can connect those dots. Julie Watson, you talked about a project that you had in Ferguson, Missouri with National Audubon. Do you want to unmute yourself and share anything further with that?
Yeah, so I work in Nevada now for the Department of Wildlife, but I left a job with the National Audubon Society. And we started some really, it's a success even more so now after I left. My predecessor has taken it and run with it and made it even more so, but someone kind of brought it up, you know, Dr. Drew Lanham is on the board of the National Audubon Society, and Dion Ferris is our DEI person there at Audubon. Like, you have these people at the very top that are of color, are distinctive people of color, and are absolutely supporting all of these diversity efforts. So it was so easy for us to put a lot of our plans into place, which were, we did programming with Outdoor Afro in St. Louis, and most people have heard of Ferguson, Missouri. The schools that we worked with, St. Louis is a segregated city. The schools that I worked with were 98% Black. And we started a bunch of programming there, and it was so easy to get support. They were like, we're gonna fundraise. If we could find the money, we could do whatever we wanted, as long as it was meeting these goals that we were creating. So we created a free summer camp in Ferguson that has a 110-acre park owned by the Ferguson Florissant School District. There's very few places like that in the entire country. And we got camp counselors from the school district we paid them money from the high school to be a part of this program. So we started creating that pipeline. So we had the summer camp. We started an intern program that was paid $10 an hour. And we hired people from the community so that we could get that pipeline going. And then I started putting it in motion, but it wasn't in motion until after I left. But something called Flight Crew, which is for the high school level going into college, which is a summer program where they shadow a bunch of wildlife biologists and they help with education programming. And all of it is paid, which was really important. We could not have volunteers. And now in my current position, I really can't create jobs. And that's a struggle right now with trying to create that pipeline of having diverse hires within our organization.
That's amazing. And you bring up a good point, is that finances can be its own monster when it comes to things that are filtering out or hindering the success of these efforts. You know, it's like, you want to do everything you can, but if you can't pay people to not work and to instead do what you're asking them and what you're offering them, that disqualifies so many. And that's a lot of my even friends who are interested in wildlife, like, they couldn't afford to be a zookeeper, you know, because you have to work for free for 3 years to even get into that career. So kind of just it is important to address those very, tangible barriers. So in addition to relationship building, in addition to knowing the community, you do need to address those issues. Just like you said, that's awesome, Julie. Thank you for sharing.
And we have another comment that someone who was a curator at a zoo, and that they increased diversity in their department through recruitment and recruiting applicants that could either speak multiple languages or those that have other community-based education experiences. So looking at a diversity of experience, they may not be specifically related to the job, but it gives you a a good suite of skills that are needed in that job, even if it was in a different discipline before. Love the emphasis on building relationships. Growing Up Wild is an amazing professional development program for early childhood educators, which are not diverse and non-traditional group for wildlife agencies. Wonderful to connect daycare providers with nature outside the door and get them to form early learning connections with children and families. And then Kim, who works for U.S. Forest Service, mentioned about the fact that recently the administration creating the executive order to stifle diversity training in federal agencies, and hopefully at some point figuring out a way to address that we can address how our partners in diversity and inclusion can proceed without discussing certain words or theories that are mentioned in the memo. And she includes that link. If you're wanting to expand on any of this stuff, you're welcome to. I know politics gets a little difficult, but it's that's happening in real time right now, this week. If someone's genes will have the answer, Scott, like that quote from you. And then Corina is SPURB ambassador for this work. Isn't it true that there are older white men and women who mostly populate conservation agencies shouldn't shy away from it, and that we need to lean in and do what we can, all of us together, right? So curious about your views on that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it takes a lot of courage to do that, because you are essentially putting yourself in a position to be wrong about a lot of things, right? So it's like when you, if you're someone who's used to being around people like you all the time, and then you choose to put yourself in a space where you are not familiar, right? And you can try and prepare yourself as much as you can. It's going to be uncomfortable, and you will have to learn, and you will have to correct, and you will have to relearn some things. And I think that some people aren't willing to do that. So I've, encountered a lot of, people who, usually like older white people who are, I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid to do the wrong thing. I'm afraid to be wrong. And it's like, you will definitely be wrong at some point, and you just have to be okay with that. Because the structure of who's at the center of authority has been the same way for a really long time, and that's changing now. Like if we want the power dynamics to shift, to be equitable, people have to be willing to be wrong. And so I think I absolutely encourage every old white person to lean into the certain discomfort that will come from that.
And I think that's part of the issue. I mean, I'm an older white woman, but I'm also a woman who's worked in wildlife conservation, which is a heavily dominated male field. So my experience up until now in diversity and inclusion has been trying to mentor younger women that I see enter our agency and feel displaced, and trying to make sure they understand that there is a career here. You can last more than 2 decades in an agency such as this, in a division that is all men, that can happen. So, but at the same time, when I talk about diversity and inclusion with regards to LGBTQI or people of color, I know that I have said the wrong things many times, and I'm hopeful that I surround myself with people who will correct me and help me along the way. So I think we need to be passionate advocates for diversity, equity, inclusion, even if we're the people that have dominated that place in the past. And what I've heard a lot of is pass the mic. We need to pass the mic. We need to amplify other people's voices and learn how to step back and let others talk. So that can be an important part of it, I think.
And I think one thing that I wanted to add is that I think the substance of that is setting yourself up, which I kind of mentioned before, to be accountable to the people who have historically been pushed out, right? So these people who haven't had the mic, you need to position yourself, your life, to be accountable to those people. And that is the way to, when you surround yourself with people who are not like you, that is how you learn, that is how you grow, improve. We know this, but I think that doing it is often very hard, but accountability is so important.
And so there's definitely talk about apprenticeships and developing an expanded social structure and mentors within diverse communities. So it's not the homogeneous group that's mentoring, but finding people in diverse communities to mentor. So there's a lot of conversation around that.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just reading the comments. I'm reading the chat. It's a lot just talking about right now internships or apprenticeships and mentorships. getting diversity through camp counselors and educators, but what's that next step? An internship program. So I don't know, it's general conversation about that. So if you have ideas around that.
Yeah, so I think it's really important. So I'm not sure whose comment it was, but as you mentioned, Shelley, it's important that as often as it's possible, that mentors come from the communities of the mentees, right? And so if the programming, whatever programming, right? So the Georgia Audubon Connecting Students to Birds Through STEM program, Georgia Audubon is not coming into the classrooms and teaching about birds. We could do that, you know what I mean? Like we have the staff, we have the expertise, but no, we're training the teachers to do that. So those students are then hearing, they see a familiar face, this is their teacher who they know from their community. That is the person telling them this information, sharing this information. And of course we do outreach education events from the staff. But the crux of that program is equipping mentors, equipping teachers who these students already know. And so if there's the capacity to train mentors who then do the mentoring, I think that is a very worthwhile investment for any group addressing these issues.
So are there any other questions, since you can put more questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you want to be brave.
I think that oftentimes when it comes to like relationship-based work that requires people to go out and to form connections with communities. So even though I kind of shared some tips and some ways to conceptualize that, I'm curious to know if people have had experience with that particular kind. So I know, I can't remember your name, I'm so sorry, who just shared about National Audubon's initiative, but are there people who have had particular experiences with relationship building, and what did that look like tangibly? I have had, my own experiences, but I would love to hear if any other people have had those kinds of experiences.
I'm just making sure I'm not missing chats.
So I guess one example, while
here, are there any successful examples in Corina's or anyone else's experience of getting underrepresented groups interested in more malign critters, such as herps, mollusks, crayfish, arthropods, etc.?
So
specific question, I like it.
Yeah, so I think to me, and this, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else, this is my perspective. I think the biggest part of my identity that contributed to me being very anti those creepy things, right, was the fact that I was from the city. So I was very disconnected with any wildlife really, but especially like any like little stuff, invertebrates, all that was just like, that's vermin. You know what I mean? All of that was in the same room, that was vermin. And so I had to have repeated exposure to them before. Like I had never even touched a snake until I was, how was I, 19, something like that. And I love animals, right? And I'm like the biggest fanatic. And I was like shaking, touching a snake, shaking, touching a mouse or a Madagascar hissing cockroach. So I think that it's less about necessarily, maybe the ethnic demographic. And again, speaking from only my perspective, and more about what the experience of the people have been. Like there are plenty of Black people who are from the country, right? Never lived in a city, who, they go fishing, they're touching worms, they're touching all kinds of, and I'm hanging out with them and I'm like, I can't do it. You know what I mean? Like even now, so I think it's more about what is the background experience of the person when it comes to access and to these, creepy things. And I think if people have the opportunity to see it in person, which is why I think I'm a personal fanatic of ambassador animals. So if people have access to providing real life opportunities to encounter these animals, I think that is, and it's okay, people are going to say ill, people are going to scream and be grossed out. That's okay. I think that those kind of hands-on experiences are very valuable, and that is why I have become personally more comfortable with those creatures.
And someone mentioned the fact that one of the barriers are that wildlife biologist positions in their state actually come up very infrequently. And so if doing a huge recruitment when there actually aren't positions available for the people that you're recruiting can cause issues. So it's not even a question. It's just more of, this is another issue, is we don't have positions that come up. People come and they stay in the field for their career. And so it's rare to see positions in some states come up, at least with a fish and game agency.
Right. And I think that's a really good example of why a long game approach, like a scenario in which, so maybe like a single position comes up once every, I don't know, like 5, 10, I don't know what's typical for you guys' field, but what you can address, again, maybe you can't get an adult professional in a career right now, but you can address the fact that a lot of kids don't know about this career. So you may not see return on investment for something like investing in grade school kids or college kids or high school kids until years from now, but that's an investment that has to happen in order to see that eventual change, especially for a career where there's very low turnover for employees. So that's what I think would be a great context to really invest in that long-term approach.
Let me see. Oh, someone is suggesting that Audubon or another organization should take ownership of the day when Chris Cooper had the interaction in Central Park, and make that a day of getting outdoors and give out thousands of binoculars and make it a day of diversity and outdoor education. And I know that that's what you and others did with Black Birders Week, which I told you on the phone was one of the most inspiring weeks I've ever had. If I just needed a lift, I went and looked up the hashtags for the day to just see all these individual stories of how they connect with nature. And I saw people online that were from my state and that had the same passions and interests I did, and names that I didn't know. And I saw a lot of names that I do know, but it was great to get some new names. That's where we found you. So it really was, just listening to the question and answers and the Facebook Lives in the evening were so inspiring. I teach a class, and I'm using that in my class this year, and I'm spending 2 weeks on the subject because it was just so powerful. And again, it's connecting a lot of dots and saying that it's important work. So he was just saying Audubon should go ahead, take ownership of that day and make it an official national holiday. I agree.
Yeah, no, that would be a phenomenal idea. And I might just pass that along. So
there you go. So I know that we're hitting up on time. And so I think we can keep conversations going in the chat if you want. And Corina has